collaborative. And I'm very excited that Matt Miller's back in the picture. Senator Ujal's constituent liaison, and we're really excited to see him back in the picture and participating. Stacy, I'll introduce you in a second because you deserve a long introduction. Ed Siri is a farmer rancher in La Cienega and then one of the new members of the La Cienega Valley Association. Patricio Pacheco, I don't know your title, but you're with the city, and he was a great addition to our discussions as always. And Andrew, the same thing. Valerie, you are the outreach person for the New Mexico Environmental Law Center. Got that. Okay, Andrew Irwin has always been a great addition to our group. Carol, very much welcome to you, City Councilor Carol Romero Worth. Carol Cooper is a person who lives in a beautiful community called El Cañon. Bill Schneider is Water Resources and Conservation Program Manager. Jamie Park is the attorney, and I've got it written down, program coordinator and staff attorney for the Acequia Association. Maslin Locke is the staff attorney for New Mexico Environmental Law Center. And so with that, Bill, we're going to allow you to go first. So if you would like to start it off with a update on the pipeline. Thank you.
Thank you, Carl. Carl, is there any chance I'd be able to share my screen?
Andy's controlling that.
All right, Andy, if that's a possibility. Thank you for allowing me to provide a brief update on the city's proposed San Juan Chama return project and where things stand relative to the environmental permitting. And so I'm going to share my screen. Again, I will keep this to 10 minutes. But I pulled some slides together for the benefit of the group with the intent that, get this started here, I could help assist the conversation with respect to the Bureau of Geology, as well as the city and county planning process for the lower Santa Fe River. So this graphic that we have developed basically illustrates the lower Santa Fe River as defined by the reach below the Paseo Real, which is here by my cursor. We have effectively the red dashed lines represent losing reaches, and then the green represent gaining reaches. As the river migrates through the Cerros de Rio lava flow, through the escarpment, down through La Bajada, onto two pueblos, through this monstrosity of a dam called Cochiti Dam, and then onto the Rio Grande. And so Stacy, I believe, and Alex will be touching on sort of the interconnect of this lower Santa Fe River with the Rio Grande. And I wanted to bring to everybody's attention, just in the recent development of a master's thesis conducted at New Mexico Highlands University, where Ryan Mann measured continuously for one whole water year flows down the Santa Fe River below the Paseo Real all the way onto Cochiti to allow us to better understand the surface hydrology. And another key component of the NEPA and the process will be really effectively, what will the lower Santa Fe River look like if the city pursues the project to the point where there will no longer be releases of San Juan Chama water to the lower Santa Fe River. And I will touch on that in a moment. But a key piece, and something we've had discussions at staff level with the county, is how to address the hydrologic issues in the La Cienega Creek system. And a key point, and I'm hopeful that the Bureau of Geology could touch on this, is that in many respects, this Cienega Creek system is hydrologically distinct, or in some respects separate from the lower Santa Fe River below Paseo Real. And to sort of highlight that point, is the Bureau of Geology published a map showing water level responses over time And what it basically demonstrated, unfortunately, this legend sort of hides the lower Santa Fe River, which is where my cursor is. And here's La Cienega, and then here's that whole dendritic tributary system. And what it effectively shows is green illustrates where water levels are rising, and the size of that circle corresponds to rate of rise. But everywhere below Paseo Real, and quite frankly, everywhere within the city limits around the city well field, as well as around the Buckman well field, water levels are rising. And this is really a strong demonstration of the city's sustainable and conjunctive water management program. Now, the same cannot be said about La Cienega. And the Bureau of Geology has done an amazing amount of work here, high quality work, independent, and it demonstrates that water levels are depleted. And there's a lot of reasons for that. And certainly, hopefully that'll get touched on today. And so that's this blue dashed line more or less represents what I would deem sort of groundwater divide in some respects. So what we would propose, when we being the water division, would propose for this group, the traditional collaborative, is to consider through the city-county planning process is to maybe divide the areas into more manageable chunks, if you will, segments or reaches. Because what's happening below Paseo Real, where we have the wetlands, for example, is uniquely different than what's happening in La Cienega. And so there's hydrologic reasons, there's technical reasons, there's maybe even political reasons why it makes sense to maybe consider that through this planning process. So I'm proposing that based on Ryan Mann's work, the Bureau of Geology's work that goes back 50 years to Spiegel and Baldwin at the USGS. There are reasons to explore management principles in a segmented fashion. So I put that out there simply for your consideration. Now, shifting to the city's proposed San Juan Chama return project, this is a graphic we've been presenting that illustrates since the Buckman direct diversion has come online, this circle represents the 4 sources of supply and the contribution of each. And since the BDD has been developed by a joint program between the city and county, the city has transformed from a predominantly groundwater-based system to a surface water-based system. And of our 8,600 on average demand, nearly 4,000 of that is met currently by San Juan Chama water brought in from the Buckman direct diversion. And then little less than 3,000 is brought in through the Canyon Road water treatment plant. Of that proportion of all these 4 sources, these other 2 are groundwater, Buckman, city wells. Roughly, on average, 35% of that water is lost to consumption, either outdoor watering, leaks, whatever use. That water does not return through the city's sewer shed to the Paseo Real. And basically, on average, of that 8,600 acre feet produced, 5,600 of that arrives back at the Paseo Real. 65% of our demand returns to the treatment plant. And so this proposed project only explores the city's contract water with the Department of Interior for our San Juan Chama water. And so I think everyone on the call recognizes that this contract water would be routed in this proposal through a pipeline back to the Buckman direct diversion so it could be reclaimed as potable supply through a return flow credit application. And so as relative to NEPA, what NEPA will explore is the significance and impacts, the environmental impacts of the city's reclamation or rediversion of San Juan Chama water from the Paseo Real back to the BDD. Now, Carl asked me to touch on schedule. And as I get to that, I just want to kind of respectfully remind everybody here is that since the BDD has come online, the city has been returning to the lower Santa Fe River nearly almost 5,000 acre feet per year. And this is during a time of extreme drought. This is a significant amount of water. This is more water that naturally flows into McClure Reservoir. And why is that? Because of our imported sources, San Juan Chama water and Buckman Wellfield water. Now, sort of touching on sort of the issues at hand, the city, I want to clearly state that our city councilors, our governing body, has directed staff to work through a planning process. We recognize the rights, water rights of diverters on the reaches. That is not in question. In fact, that is why we're emphasizing our contract water to allow native water to the Santa Fe watershed to remain in the watershed to the benefit of all the community. And so the fact that we're cutting back pumping is really bringing benefit as the Bureau of Geology's data clearly shows. Now, how do we resolve the issues below the water treatment facility? How do we ensure that both drinking water as well as irrigation water makes it down to La Bajada and the intervening irrigators that have very old, if you will, water rights? How do we address declining water levels in La Cienega? These are all issues we are hopeful that we will sit around the table, work together, and resolve through the city and county endorsed planning process. But this figure clearly shows, as these blue dots or these larger dots, these mutual domestic wells, clearly shows, and I mean, we can't, we have to recognize the fact that a new sort of paradigm is basically the proliferation of groundwater pumping below the Paseo Real. And how to address that, hopefully, will be a big topic of this planning process. And so to the conversation of NEPA, just want to close with just 3 main points. One is that NEPA is led not by the city, but by the Bureau of Reclamation. They're a federal agency that will be conjunctively working with the Forest Service and the BLM. They will be the lead. They'll be consulting with the tribal entities, who both Cochiti, Santo Domingo, Tesuque, etc. And the key thing here is there will be a public process as part of the NEPA. There will be it's a 6-month effort, and there will be basically a 45-day period where there will be a public meeting, and we will do a public scoping, share the project, and everybody can comment and contribute to the process. And so we have a meeting today with Reclamation. We're trying to dial in when is the right time. One of the questions that's come up is, how do we best reach the community to have these discussions? Can we have a public meeting in person? Does it need to be through Zoom? Can it be a hybrid? So these are part of our discussions today. In an ideal world, from my standpoint, the NEPA process will kick off. There will be public notification. There will be comment period starting in July. I don't know if we'll meet that goal. As I said, right now we're trying to work through a COVID world on trying to achieve the best way to share this information with the community. So with that, I guess I'll stand for any questions, Carl.
Okay, any questions?
Bill, Darren Munzberg, I'd like to ask you kind of in parallel, say the NEPA compartmentalized and segmented by itself, okay? What portion of city waters or, resources and conservation's EMS is that NEPA, is this pipeline? Where are we in the bigger process of the city waters environmental management system that this works in? Or are you expecting that the NEPA public participation process is the be all and end all of a robust stakeholder planning input?
Yeah, thank you, Darren. It's a very insightful question. And so what we're trying to achieve is to explore the merits and the feasibility of the pipeline through the NEPA process, because environmental permitting certainly is very onerous and may put stringent conditions on our ability to route our San Juan Chama water back to the BDD. Specific to your question, In an ideal world, again, this is my perspective, I guess, and certainly probably represents at least the water division. We would like to have the planning process focused on native water to the Santa Fe River, meaning we would like to explore what the river looks like in the absence of San Juan Chama water. But to that point, meaning less groundwater pumping, and Carl likes to utilize the word mitigation. What can be done to alleviate pressures on groundwater so that the springs and seeps can be reestablished? And that may mean bringing in water lines to La Cienega. That may mean reducing pumping on domestic wells. But we recognize the water rights on the lower Santa Fe River. But I guess I respectfully suggest those rights don't tie to San Juan Chama water in any way.
Right. So, but where we're at is that we have to figure out a way to assist the city in meeting its obligation to those senior water right holders, and maybe explore, I think, the recycling process. So if it's just return San Juan Chama water to the Rio Grande and leave the Santa Fe River watershed to its own, part of that is, as we go into the 21st century, further and further into climate change, is looking at how our human intervention and human stewardship through a sound recycling process serves to reduce demand, serves to support the lower watershed. It seems like just geographically, the Paseo Real treatment plant is in a unique position. But what we've seen from the collaborative over the last 10 years is that, yes, there's releases going into the lower watershed. It's a question of flow. So I think that and we've identified some serious obstacles there. So I'm glad to see that BLM and Forest Service are at the same table with city water and now with the county too. And I think the rest of these stakeholders. This is what we've been working toward for the last decade. So, but I did want to comment on segmenting the reaches of the river. I think that is important for tightening scope, for focusing objectives, for meeting those different technical requirements of core processes and key processes in the different reaches of the river, because they are separate, but they do combine into a whole. And so we do have to keep those together in a holistic perspective. And I think to that end, we have to be sure as we separate those segments into different key processes or key concerns that we don't separate the stakeholders, that we don't create division among the group that we have assembled here, right? And a little bit broader that I think might not be present today, but not too much. You've got the right people in the room right now. But we have to make sure that we're all able to see it as a whole, and we don't lose track and become myopic, each on our own little, stream, if you will.
Okay, I'm going to have to cut this off now. I'm cutting this off because this is really important stuff. This is worthy of another discussion without question, and so we can reschedule this. But I want to proceed with Dr. Rinehart's and Stacy's presentation. And thank you, Bill. Appreciate it very much. I think you've given us some things to think about, and certainly we understand some of the concerns the city has about well pumping. So with that, I'd like to introduce Dr. Alex Rinehart, who is the Assistant Professor of the Earth and Environmental Research Department at New Mexico Tech. He is a professor, and his area expertise spans hydrology, geophysics, and rock mechanics, none of which I understand. But thank you very much for being here. And also Stacy Timmons, who is a long-term friend of our community. She is Associate Director of the Hydrogeology program at New Mexico Bureau of Geology and Mineral Resources. And what's really cool about Stacy, she would like us, if we can come up with some questions, she would like to be able to take those back to New Mexico Tech and do further research on specific issues. And I think Bill came up with one already. Specific issues that the Bureau might be able to research and provide us some information. But very quickly, I just want to thank Stacy. She is my kind of go-to person whenever I have a science question. She calms me down and explains in detail. and it's all with science. And I think that's one of the things that's really important for all of us to remember is what we do needs to be based in science. It can't be a political decision anymore. And so she's been, as I said, a long-term friend of the community. She raises chickens, which I appreciate. And so with that, Dr. Rinehart, please proceed. Thank you so much for being here, Stacy and Dr. Rinehart.
All right. Thank you, Buzz. Thank you for the introduction. So yeah, I used to work for Stacy. So I was at the Bureau of Geology for about 5 years, and then I switched over to the academic side to do a little bit more like weird research. And so, but while I was at the Bureau, I worked over at Peña Blanca and did a study there. And then a couple of years ago, tried to tie together the work that, Peggy Johnson and Stacy and Dan Koning did in La Cienega to the things that we saw over in Peña Blanca. I'm gonna share my screen. I've been a prof for a couple of years. So I still am very much an applied kind of person. So this talk is really focused on the connection between what we call the southern Espanola basin, right, which is where La Cienega is and the lower Santa Fe River is, and the northern part of the Albuquerque basin, which is where Peña Blanca and Cochiti Pueblo and Santo Domingo Pueblo are. And trying to understand how water flows between these two basins. I'm going to try to maximize. I'm on Socorro internet, so I apologize if there's a lag. There's usually a lag. So, all right. So let's just start out with sort of the major conclusions of this compilation that that we've put together. So basically, there is groundwater flow between the Espanola Basin and the northernmost Albuquerque Basin, and that basically goes under La Bajada Mesa and La Majada Mesa, or what growing up in Albuquerque, what we call La Bajada Hill. There is not a connection from La Cienega into the Albuquerque Basin. And we'll talk about why that's the case in a little bit. Some of that flow is probably along the sort of coarse, sands along the Santa Fe River. Most of the groundwater flow looks like it's from the regional aquifers in the Espanola Basin. So the same aquifers that are recharging, say, like the parts of the Buckman well field. So that's in these, sand channels that are encased in sort of, fine-grained mud. And then that spills into the Albuquerque Basin in the subsurface, and then, contributes to the Rio Grande, over the course of what we think is probably hundreds to thousands of years. The connection with the Santa Fe River, we think, is very, very fast. At least where Stacy and Peggy and the folks at the Bureau looked. Okay, so I'll start out. I just want to make sure that we're all sort of on the same page about basics of groundwater flow. Surface water is a little bit more intuitive. Groundwater is weird because you can't see it, right? So it's, you can't see it. That's the big challenge in groundwater flow. But it's still pretty intuitive, right? Water goes downhill. Water goes downhill. So, you go out and you measure water table elevations. And if you go from a high elevation to a low elevation, the water's flowing in that direction. Now, the rate of that flow is controlled by both the slope, that sort of like, rolling a ball down a steep slope versus a shallow slope, and what we call the hydraulic conductivity. Okay, so in groundwater flow, there aren't underground rivers. The flow's happening, usually very slowly between sand grains. It's sort of like a bathtub full of sand that you saturate with water, that you fill up with water. So there's not underground, rivers, and so the flow is usually slow. And if you have coarse sand, right, then there's more space between the sand grains, and so then it's easier for the water to flow. If you have, say, like clay, then then it's much tighter, right? And it's less permeable than the larger grain sizes. The size of an individual sand grain versus an individual little flock of clay. What do we mean by tighter? So this is one of the things that people spend a lot of time not thinking about correctly. And so sand is much, much more permeable than anything with any sort of clay in it, or even silt. Like 1,000,000 times more permeable, right? And to give this some physical context, this is the difference between the distance between Peña Blanca and La Cienega and the diameter of a dime, okay? And so this is why, if you look at the southern Espanola basin and you think about the groundwater system, the wells are penetrating into old channels. And this is also, I believe, the case in La Cienega, where there's sand and there's almost no flow in the muddier sediments that surround the buried channels. Okay, and this is also the reason that in the Rio Grande basin, like around Peña Blanca, their wells are completed in ancient Rio Grande sands and gravels, because there's enough permeability there. So we tend to say things like, oh, the permeabilities or the hydraulic conductivities are different. They're a little bit different. When we say a little bit different, that's kind of like the difference between like 10 and 100, or like 1,000 and 10,000, and that certainly is a large difference in terms of like the normal ways that we think about this. But it's small compared to the difference between the hydraulic conductivity of sand versus clay. Okay, so the major points here are groundwater flow is happening within sort of bodies of sand, usually, at least in this area. And you can basically choke off groundwater flow by having areas that have some sort of mud in it, right? Now, one thing that happens, so this is a figure from a textbook, and so let me just annotate, so we'll make things a little bit clearer. So here, this is an example from California. One of the things in the Rio Grande Basin that controls a lot of the groundwater flow is faults. And so, we are in the Rio Grande Rift, and it's where the crust is very, very slowly spreading apart, and you have essentially these big, basins that have been filled with sand over, millions of years. And the places where it's spreading apart the most is also where we have small earthquakes, and along those small the plains that those small earthquakes happen are these faults. Okay, and so when an earthquake happens, it shatters all the sand grains and it turns it from coarse grain stuff into fine grain stuff, and it chokes off the flow, okay, in terms of groundwater. So this is a groundwater elevation contour map, and you can see nice and even spaced contours coming down here. And then right here where there's the fault, right, you can see the groundwater sort of back up. This is sort of like, if you put your thumb over the end of the hose, right, you have to build up pressure and it squirts out really hard, right? So if you lower the hydraulic conductivity, you have to build up enough head for the flow to get through, okay? And then once you get across the fault, you can get flow across the fault, but it tends to be a little bit slower. The contours, open up, and the rate of flow continues to be about the same, okay? So the main point here is that where we have faults, even if it's sand on sand, you can end up causing your aquifer to decrease in terms of how much flow goes from one side of the fault to the other. Okay, all right. So those are the major points. The other thing that happens with faulting, just to make sure that we're all on the same page, is that the rocks will offset. Okay, so the earthquake happens and it offsets a little bit. So one side in the Rio Grande Rift at least will come down, and then over the course of millions of years, right, it'll come down more and more and more and more and more. And so this is why we have the mountains that are on one side of the rift, you know, like the Sandia Mountains and Sangre de Cristos and the Manzanos and everything. This is also why there's sort of a high a little bit to the west of La Cienega. Part of that's because there's a bunch of basalts and stuff that have protected it from erosion. Part of it's because there's actually a series of faults that come down. And so there's a high point where there's low permeability bedrock or shale. So let me clear this before I go on to the next slide. All right. So that's like 4 weeks of material in like 3 minutes or 5 minutes or something. So let's talk about where we're looking. Okay, so this is from a USGS report from 2006, Sawyer and Miner. So here's Peña Blanca. Okay, here's La Cienega. Here's the Santa Fe River. All right, here's, you know, the gap into the basalt flows. All right, and then it flows down to Cochiti Dam. Okay.
Alex, I'm not seeing your
Yes,
screen.
yes, sir.
We still have the fault screen. There we go. There we go. Got it.
Okay. All right. Yeah. So like I said, I'm on Socorro internet, so there's a lag. So yeah, there's a lag. So here, you know, we have a couple of, you know, what they call mesas, which are sort of these, you know, benches. So there's La Majada Mesa, so that's that big flat, right, when you're driving into Cochiti from I-25 that you drive across. And then there's La Bajada Mesa, okay, and then you can see here you have all these basalt flows and stuff. All right, you know, there's the escarpment that I-25 goes up. Okay. All right, so that should get us a little bit oriented. I'm gonna hang on a sec. Everything takes a little bit longer with Zoom because of, you know, basically because of the lag. So okay, and again, like we're you know, this talk is focused on, you know, if there's flow from here to here, right? From, you know, from the southern Espanola basin, from, you know, sort of the lower Santa Fe reach, across La Bajada Mesa and La Majada Mesa to, over towards Cochiti and Peña Blanca and Santo Domingo Pueblo. Okay, that's what this talk is about. All right. Okay, so we usually start with the geology. So you know, we talked a little bit about how, like, you know, the size of grains, you know, in the underground ends up controlling the groundwater flow. And so there's been quite a bit of mapping out here over the last couple of decades. This is from this 2006 report. Dan Koning has updated particularly the area around La Cienega as part of the hydrogeology study with Stacy and Peggy. And so on this map, just to orient you, you know,
Alex,
here's the Santa Fe River. Yes.
sorry, we're caught up now.
Okay.
Go ahead, start pointing.
Okay. All right. This is going to be like a chronic issue. So I apologize for it in advance. Okay.
Alex, maybe turn off your video to save bandwidth.
Okay. Stop
Idea.
video. Okay. All right. So on this map, right, all the things that are tan and brown and this blue, that blue, that's all basically sand and muds. The blue is Rio Grande sands, okay, and these tans and, well, basically the tans and browns are what we call alluvium, and so where those are, you know, old channels, those are sands and sandy, and away from the channels they get muddier, and so they get less permeable. Okay. Now, you know, the purples and grays are all volcanic rocks, and those impact the groundwater flow a little bit, but not a huge amount. Okay, not a huge amount. The main control for La Cienega are these greens and blues here. Okay, so those are much older rocks. So those are rocks from when, you know, dinosaurs were running around. So, you know, 100 million years to, I think, like 150 million years old rocks. And these have very low hydraulic conductivity. So these are barriers to flow, okay? And so groundwater flow won't go across these. All right. I'll try to keep track of time. It's, you know, these Zooms are always, I appreciate you guys actually being active and telling me that things are lagging, because it, you know, keeps me from just kind of rambling on. So, all right. So there's that. And then we're going to take a look at two cross sections that Sawyer and Miner made in this, you know, really large report that integrated about, I think it was like 6 years worth of mapping and geophysics and water level measurements. It was a ton of work. And so cross sections are essentially what we think is happening in the subsurface in terms of the rocks. But it's what we think. So one of the big challenges here is that we have a lot of wells in like Peña Blanca, La Cienega, you know, in places where there are people. And then once you get off into the rangelands, particularly on the pueblos, on the reservations, there's very little well coverage. And so this is still sort of basically what we think is going on in the subsurface. And so we're going to start at this northern line, this, if you can see it, C to C prime. And we're going to see what, you know, Sawyer and Miner think is going on down there. Okay. And so over here at C, you know, you're in the Jemez Mountains. I'll hang on a second, let it catch up. And then here's the Rio Grande, okay? And then over here, this is essentially La Bajada Mesa over here. And you can see there are these places where there's offset between the different layers of rock, okay? And so those are all faults. Each one of these lines that I'm sketching in here, these are all faults. And so those are all gonna impede flow to some extent. Not necessarily as much as you might think, but it'll impede flow. Now, one of the important things to note on this is that you can go, let me just get this back, clear it, get this here. You can go from sand and clay units, but recent units where your wells are completed over in La Cienega, and you can flow continuously in that sand all the way to the Rio Grande. Now, there is this basalt flow that they think is buried here, and that will be a barrier to flow, but at least in the shallow part of the system, there is a connection, okay? There's a possible connection between the Espanola basin over here, where La Cienega is, and to the Rio Grande. So just to remind you where this is, it's so laggy, I'll just go on to the next one. So the next cross section is what we think is happening basically right where the Santa Fe River punches through the basalt flows, or cuts through the basalt flows, okay? And this is also what is more or less happening a little bit further south. And so here you have a groundwater system. This is, you know, what is controlling the seeps and the springs that are popping up there, that is disconnected because we have this green area here, which is a Mancos shale. And so that's very, very tight. These are the rocks that, you know, keep all the oil and gas in the San Juan Basin, you know, down for, you know, millions and millions of years, right? And keeps all that stuff, all of the oil and gas separated from the, you know, from the aquifers above. It's the Mancos shale. So this is very, very low permeability. So there's no flow across the Mancos shale. And so then once you come out here, right, then where the Santa Fe River, you know, spills into the system, you can have flow through the sandy sediments in the Albuquerque basin, but it's not flowing directly from the east. Okay, there's no path there. Okay, there's no path there. Okay, I'll wait a sec and let this catch up. All right. So we have, you know, where La Cienega is distinct and is its own little compartment of groundwater that's being fed from water, you know, upslope from there in the Espanola Basin. And then you have the possibility of flow coming in regionally across these sands underneath, underneath La Bajada Mesa and La Majada Mesa. So the USGS did this big regional study, and they tried to understand how groundwater flow is, happening in this region. So again, I will wait just a sec. All right, so here's the Santa Fe River, okay? And this right here is where it hits the basalt flows, okay? And then the Santa Fe River comes, out here and joins the Rio Grande, close to Coche de Pueblo, okay? So just to get you oriented on this. All right. Now, remember we're going from upslope to downslope. And so over here, we're at 5,800 feet in terms of the water table elevation. The contours on the map are estimates of the water table elevation. And then you're going down slope, from east to west. And then there's like basically no wells under the La Bajada. There's only a handful of wells underneath La Bajada Mesa. And then you come out into this system, right, where the Rio Grande is, and then you have some more wells. And you can see that there's continuing flow there. There's also flow. I'll do the little animation thing where I put arrows on this. Okay. So this is basically what, just based off of the groundwater elevations and this sort of, drawing in the water table contours. This is what Sawyer and Miner thought was going on. But again, there's not a whole lot of control in this area here, okay? So using the data from the Bureau, so this is data that, myself and, collected over in Peña Blanca, and for the rest of the slides, red points are going to be Peña Blanca points. And these blue points over here, that's all the points from Stacy and Peggy's study. Okay, so red is for Peña Blanca, blue is for La Cienega. Okay, and so we measured, water table elevations, and I also pulled a bunch from the USGS and made a more refined contour map. And there's essentially like a big data gap here, okay, between the two basins. And so, we know that there's the geology that makes groundwater flow possible between the two. We know that La Cienega is in sort of a separate little compartment, hydrogeologically, but we don't have, just based off of the physical measurements, we don't actually know, we can't prove that there's flow across here. This is a question mark, okay? And so what we've done, and what the rest of the talk is about, is looking at the water chemistry and what's called the stable isotopes, and I'll talk very briefly about what that means, to actually show what kinds of connections there are. So are the connections just from the river? Do we see regional flow through the aquifers from one basin to the other? Or do we just see water spilling and infiltrating out from the Santa Fe River into the, into the Albuquerque basin? So those are sort of the two ways that you can think about this. All right, so here are all the places that we have water chemistry and stable isotope measurements. Again, the warm colors, I'll wait a sec. The warm colors are Peña Blanca samples, and the cool colors are all La Cienega samples. Okay, and so these are all the places that we collected. And again, notice that there's nothing really, we don't have water quality or stable isotopes data here, between these two clusters, at least not in this study. I haven't had a chance yet to pull to see if the USGS data, it has data there. Okay. All right. So this is always a confusing plot. Okay, but this is a way of looking at the proportions. So So essentially, you know, when groundwater flows through the ground, it dissolves the rock a little bit. And when it does that, it picks up different amounts of different kinds of salt. And so you can have salts that have chloride in it, right? So like table salt, sodium chloride. Okay, where's the sodium at? You can have things like the stuff that makes, you know, the white and the caliche, right? So that's calcium carbonate or calcite. So that's calcium. And then this, where is it? The CO3, right? That's carbonate. And then you can also have sources of magnesium and sulfate, okay? And so the thing I want to make super clear on this plot is this is a way of looking at water quality data to see how alike and different waters are. And so in the La Cienega samples, there are these really old waters that Stacy and Peggy found. And then there are these, you know, waters that are actually in La Cienega that are basically the outflow from the regional aquifer in the Espanola basin. And then there are these waters here, okay? And those waters there are very shallow wells along the Santa Fe River. And when we look at where the Peña Blanca wells plot up, it's this cluster of red right there. And you can see it's sort of between the Santa Fe River and where the regional aquifer is, but it's also sort of along, this is sort of background information, but commonly when you have, you know, sort of a continuous groundwater flow path in rocks that are made out of quartz, like Rio Grande sands and sands that come out of the weather and are transported out of the Sangre de Cristos, you end up following a trend like this sort of horizontal, sort of crappy looking arrow that I drew, okay? And so, you know, maybe we have, you know, we can show with this that maybe there's a connection between the regional aquifer, right? Like the waters that you have in La Cienega, but not the waters that are actually outflowing in La Cienega and the waters that we have in Peña Blanca, okay? So that's a little bit confusing, but I just want to make sure that it's clear that we're comparing the regional aquifers north of the Santa Fe River to the that we think that there's evidence that there's flow from the regional aquifers, you know, north of the Santa Fe River into the Albuquerque basin, just based off of the water chemistry. Okay. So the other way that we can look at this is with stable isotopes. So believe it or not, you know, most water molecules weigh the same, okay? But there's a very small percentage of water molecules that are a little bit heavier than others. And so maybe the hydrogen atom has an extra neutron on it, so it's a little bit heavier, and the oxygen atom, one of the oxygen atoms, well, sorry, the oxygen atom has 2 additional neutrons, so it's just a little bit heavier. Now, you know, we look at this. This is always a little, you know, it's like, yeah, you know, this is like a whole class that you cover, right? So, you know, the main thing is that because the water, you know, water is still water, even if, you know, a very small percentage of it is a little bit heavier than the other parts, you can track the source of the water, even though the chemistry of the water is changing, right? So you're dissolving more salts into the water, but the water molecules don't change. And so if you look at the regional trends in terms of the stable isotopes, you can plot up what essentially the trends that we see in the rainfall are. And then, you know, a graduate student in New Mexico Tech actually went and sampled the Rio Grande every 5 kilometers from like Colorado all the way down to Fort Quitman in Texas, and found a different trend, a very different trend between the Rio Grande and what this local water line looks like. And then if you evaporate stuff, you can think about this, you know, basically like heavier things will be left behind preferentially. it just takes more work to, lift up heavier water, water molecules. And so you'll end up with a separate evaporation trend in La Cienega, and that's something that Peggy saw. And so that happens if you have a very shallow groundwater surface. Okay. And so we use these lines to try to understand the source. And so if we're along the local meteoric water line, that means that we have water that is sourced from the Sangre de Cristos. Okay, we have Espanola basin water. Okay. If we're along the Rio Grande evaporation trend, then we have Rio Grande water. Okay. And then if we're along this La Cienega evaporation trend, then we have La Cienega water, right? Which is separate. Okay. So if we plot up all the points, so these are all the measurements that we have. Essentially what we can see once we group them, and of course this is from a poster that I made, so the language is a little bit technical. We can see a group down here in Peña Blanca. Remember, the reds are Peña Blanca samples. And those are sourced largely from the Rio Grande. Those are return flows from irrigation. We up here with these dark blues, these are shallow wells right along the Santa Fe River. And these are actually from a year when the stable isotopes of the rainfall went kind of nuts. They shifted off of the local meteoric line. And then they went back to the normal line the next year. And so we can say that the wells that are right next to the river are getting recharged within a year. So now that's very tentative. We don't have like a groundwater age or anything, but we can say that there is rapid recharge along the Santa Fe River. Okay. And then there's this area here where there's an overlap between the Peña Blanca and the La Cienega waters. And we don't really see very much in terms of sort of deeper, older groundwater, except for these 2 points over here, which I think one of these is at Cochiti Elementary, if I recall correctly. Okay. But largely what we see is very isotopically similar waters between the regional aquifer system where you guys are in La Cienega and over where Peña Blanca is. And so this basically means that there's likely the same source, and that's the source of the groundwater in the shallow aquifer over by on the east side of the river by Peña Blanca and on the Cochiti Reservation, and maybe even as far south as at least Peña Blanca and on the east side of the river on Cochiti land, is coming mostly from these regional flows that we talked about. Okay. And we can say that there's probably some direct recharge from the Santa Fe River. There's probably a little bit of recharge from the Santa Fe River, but the Santa Fe River is sort of it's not separate, but it's a very rapid system compared to the rest of this. All right, so we're back to the big regional view here, and then I'll be finishing up in a couple of minutes. This is the second to the last slide. And so, basically we've confirmed that, let me get the little annotation, and I'm going to change to what is not on there. I'm going to change to a purple. We'll see if this shows up. That shows up. Okay. So basically we have La Cienega down here. Well, it doesn't show up over there. Let me change back to the red. So La Cienega over here is a separate groundwater system, and Peggy and Stacy really clearly showed that. And then consistent with the groundwater table, right? Water goes downhill through sands. We do chemically see a connection from the southern Espanola basin into the Albuquerque basin. Now, there is probably some contribution from the Santa Fe River. We don't really have enough data to say how much, But if you just think in terms of like the area over which the flow is happening, even if it's very slow, this is a much larger area of groundwater flow, right, coming into the basin than in the Santa Fe River. Okay, and so, you know, if we had to guess, right, again, we haven't quantified this, but if we had to guess, then, you know, we'd, you know, say that probably most of the flow contributing to the Rio Grande is, you know, from the Espanola Basin is coming in not via the Santa Fe River, but underneath the mesas. Okay. All right. I'll give it a sec and then change. This is the same slide that I started the talk with. I know that I get a little bit like technical, so I try to start with the major points and then end with the same points, so that, you know, when I start gibbering about stable isotopes, like, you know, we come back home. So, so here is the major points, right? So there is groundwater flow between the Espanola Basin, north of the Santa Fe River, north of La Cienega, the village of La Cienega, and the northernmost Albuquerque Basin. Some of this flow is probably from the Santa Fe River. I think that most of the water is coming in from the regional aquifers underneath the mesas, north of where the Santa Fe River cuts through the basalt flows. We do not have good constraints on the flow rates or the relative volumes. And so I'm saying more of the water, and I'm being careful not to say like, to give a percentage, right? I'm being very careful not to say a percentage, right? Because we don't have the well coverage and we don't have any groundwater age dating, okay? Now, in other places around the state where you have, you know, situations like this, you know, it's usually taking sort of 100 to a couple thousand years to travel similar distances and similar sort of sands across sort of a similar area. Okay, and so that's a, you know, again, this is that same issue that we have with the hydraulic conductivities. That's, you know, that's an order of magnitude difference, right? And that's a large amount of uncertainty. So with that, I will end and answer any of the questions that you guys have.
Okay, anybody have any questions?
Bill's hand is up.
Okay,
Thank you,
Bill?
Alex. That's a very interesting presentation. I greatly appreciate it. We have spoken with the Bureau about the interpretation of some of the isotopic data that Peggy collected. Our reasoning being, and I could explore this offline with you, but a big source of recharge to the shallow aquifer that some of those wells were sampled from is the Paseo Real water treatment plant.
Mm-hmm.
And basically, since the 1970s, a big portion of the water leaving that plant is comprised of Buckman wellfield water. And that water, the Los Alamos National Labs dated at 50,000 years old. And so I just caution you to, when you're interpreting that data, please don't assume that it's native or natural to the system, because it's imported water that has that chemical signature in some respects, and it needs to be taken into account.
Yeah, so thank you for bringing that up, Bill. I wasn't aware of that. We have the effluent on here, so that's good. That's good information about the that's consistent with what we're seeing, right? So the stable isotopes coming from the Sangre de Cristos into the, you know, through the channel deposits that John Hawley has worked out, right, through that sort of regional alluvial fan system, and going into the Buckman well field. You know, that water should be similar isotopically to the water for these fans to the south, right, that are coming to the south. We have the effluent water on this plot, okay, and it plots right in the middle of, you know, where the Peña Blanca samples are, right? So there's all the Peña Blanca samples, there's the effluent, okay? Now, in terms of the chemistry, right, you know, like the effluent will be fresh water. The other thing that happens is that all of the groundwater ages will reset. And so if you guys start doing decided, invest a good chunk of money and do groundwater age measurements around here, the effluent should have a modern groundwater age. All right. So that's sort of my thinking on that. I wasn't aware that the effluent water was coming in from the Buckman well field, but that makes sense. So yes, Dr. Hall, John Hawley has finally been invoked. So yeah. All right. Steve, do you have a question?
Yes, I do. I appreciate the presentation. I'm sorry I missed part of it, but I just wanted to emphasize or see if you have any comment in relation to it. The important distinction between travel time based on chemistry and hydrologic response, of the hydraulics of the aquifer. They're two really different time frames to consider. And I just want to make sure the group doesn't get them mixed up in thought.
Yeah, so these regional, I'll try to answer what I think you're getting at there, Steve. So when you pump the well, if you pump a well, or if you have like a big recharge event along a river, you can move a good slug of water through the aquifer, either removing it or recharging it. And those responses, happen sort of locally to the river and to the well. So like hundreds of meters, 100 meters, 100 yards, couple hundred yards. And they happen very, very fast. And of course, like this is why like we have degrees in this gets like very complicated, very, very fast. Now that the regional flow, so if there's not pumping, and if you just have a real gentle water table gradient, the movement of water then tends to be much, much slower, right? Like 100 or 1,000 times, or even 10,000 times slower. Okay, so the time frames involved between what you see with like a pump and what you see with like a regional flow system are very, very different. Thank you for asking me to
Right, and
talk about that, Steve.
Yeah, the same thing goes with recharge, I guess. If you have a slugger recharge,
Yes,
that hydraulic response from that could be significantly much faster than the movement of the water out in front of it.
that's right. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thank you.
And I guess just to reemphasize, Alex, you did mention that despite whatever the difference are in transmission between the groundwater, the Santa Fe River remains a rapid transmission of the northern, or would you say eastern water into the Rio Grande.
Yeah, so I don't have a sense of the volume. I think the volumes from the regional groundwater flow are larger than the Santa Fe River.
Sure.
But yeah, I mean, you have a bunch of coarse sands and gravels, that are there that can both conduct flow on the subsurface, but also provide, recharge. And so, one thing that we do see, around the state and around the everywhere where there's not enough water to actually have perennial rivers is that, if you have an ephemeral river, there's oftentimes still groundwater flow, like a small groundwater high associated with that river. And there's focused recharge along that river. So that's definitely true.
Got about 9 minutes before Alex. Any other questions? Okay, Alex, thank you so much. Really deeply appreciate your presentation and information. And I'm hoping at some point we may bring you back to talk a little bit more. But really, I do appreciate you being part of the conversation today. I think you've given us a lot to think about. And I wanted to open this up now to Stacy's offer for questions that we might have that the Bureau of Geology and Mineral Resources might be able to research and look into. Obviously, I think the one thing that Bill brought up is that connection or lack of connection between the La Cienega area and the La Cienega area. And that's something we've always heard about, but no one's ever really said anything about it, whether there's a barrier that really separates the two. And there really isn't any connection between the two areas, any hydrological connection. So what other questions do we have, folks? Okay,
I have one.
okay.
I'm sure Darren probably could answer this. I don't know anyone that knows this river better than Darren. So effectively, with the Pasarial under operation, we gauge flows through the canyon that spill out into La Bajada. Some of it's diverted, stored, but then also returned. So we estimate roughly 4,000 acre feet, give or take, makes it down there. How much of it reaches the Rio Grande? It's the most compelling question that needs an answer with respect to using the river as a conduit for this, for the city to keep water in the river and get discharge credits, to meet the obligations of the downstream irrigators. We need to have the hydrology more defined.
Right, right, and that's been the challenge since 1985, but more importantly, since 2016, the challenge has been getting access to do that and establishing a cooperative relationship with the Pueblo de Cochiti's Natural Resources Conservation Department, so or Environmental Resources Department. So that remains, I know for you, Bill, I think a challenge in getting, or for Jesse too, getting an open conduit of communication and getting that information. As I say, I could tell you anecdotally, and we can all say anecdotally that, and I think Alex has just clued us in more scientifically, but that water moves in very close subsurface straits there. The question is the quantity, and the last information that we have, I think that can be easily accessed, and I guess Stacy and Alex have this at their fingertips, is the USGS stream gauging station that's right here near the village. So I think it is important, and I saw your information regarding the increased flow since the functioning of the treatment plant. I think what's important is going back to the river, the lower river in reaches, is there's some management tasks ahead of us there to make sure that water actually flows and continues flowing and is not interrupted. So we do, I think, have to separate recharge potential from return flow potential and kind of compartmentalize those. But in looking at the Santa Fe River as a conduit for return flow credit, that's the missing link. We need to get that information, be able to quantify it so we can work it into a procedure for how much water can be released down the canyon, be that from the reservoirs or management of the treatment plant, or what other diversion is going back up a pipeline or what have you. That's what we need, is that missing link of information.
If I could throw in a little bit on that dovetail, and it's a question for you, Bill Schneider, and also, of course, for Dr. Rinehart. Is measuring the groundwater flow possible from the Paseo Real wastewater treatment plant to the Rio Grande?
Stacy's smiling on that one.
Just real quick,
Is that Stacy question?
Stacy or Bill Schneider or Dr. Rinehart, sure.
I would throw in that that's not an easy question to answer. It has been the mystery of many research projects. But yeah.
I will definitely second that. That's not an easy question.
I would throw out just, if instead of just looking for common stable isotopes or what have you, you can look at the aerials and see the bosque along that river channel continuing to live. And then, of course, in periods of extreme drought where water goes deeper into the substrates, you'll see the trees start to die off. But, you can see it from portions of Highway 16. You can see it when you get down to 22 and where the water starts to migrate towards the surface again. So if nothing else, the telltale's here on the surface, Now, again, where we measure that in terms of number of trees equals, how much water is flowing through, that I need another subject matter expert for that,
So one comment I'll have about that, Darren, is that we don't actually know like how thick that sand layer is, right?
Right.
And so you can get these sort of perched aquifers, or these really thin aquifers that form in these alluvial channels. And so that's one of the big challenges, you know, when you start looking at these alluvial aquifers. I'm dealing with this. I'm doing a study in the San Augustine Plains, and it's a similar thing. We don't know how thick the sand is. And so how do you estimate the amount of groundwater flow along that channel deposit if you don't know how large the aquifer is, right? So it's a tricky thing, man. It's a tricky thing. So, but having having the Friata type, the salt cedar and the cottonwoods and stuff, having the bosque there, like that does mean the ground, yeah, I mean, absolutely, the groundwater table is close to the surface, but then the question is where is the bottom?
Right.
Right.
And Bill Schneider, follow up if I could. Bill Schneider, is the city working on any kind of potential study of this, of the groundwater flows that you're aware of?
Well, I think Alex highlighted it, Andy, is that there's a dearth of monitoring wells in critical key areas to sort of interpolate where we do have data. So we're trying, another issue, and I think Ryan Mann's research, for anyone who hasn't read his master's thesis, clearly illustrates a large portion of the water flows out onto the Pueblo and then infiltrates very quickly. There's a huge seepage loss component on the Pueblo. Not surprising. I mean, let's remember Cochiti Dam imposes a hydraulic head that affects the hydrodynamics through the valley there. And so that's another challenging piece.
So it sounds like we need a study.
This is one where I'm not going to say don't study the study. This is the one where we're lacking the information. Let's get, do we need sample wells? What do we need? Let's establish it, the protocol, and get the information so we can make an informed decision.
Stacy, is that a question you can take back and maybe do some research on?
Yeah, and I guess you kind of have to come to it also with the perspective of at what cost is it, what is it worth to get to the answer to that question? Because it seems like a simple question to answer, but in order to answer it, it could be on the order of millions of dollars to get to that, because you don't have wells in all the right areas, because a tracer study would really help do that. But there's all sorts of problems with that. There's, sampling and kind of adding on to what's already been done to fill in some of those gaps. It's, I don't know, you kind of have to frame it within that, as well as ask those hard questions and think about what the value is to the community to have that one answer. And I don't know, that's a hard little nut to crack, and perhaps it's worth having that answer. So we can go back and play with that and kind of think about some different approaches. Particularly,
well, let's throw it back to Bill and say, okay, Bill, so at what point, I mean, is there a threshold where we say, if we could find evidence that there's a return flow of so many acre feet or whatever unit you want to use, then now it's justifiable to pursue, I'm not sure exactly what. So, I mean, how important is that question to the city's water management plan at the moment? Is it something we should?
I would thank you for the question. I really like Stacy's context of the economic component.
Right.
Certainly fair and reasonable. And again, I'll roll the county into this conversation. Darren, I'll put it this way. So 5,000 acre feet leaving Paseo Real. If the city is not able to maximize its San Juan Chama water, our only other alternative, and people don't want to hear this, is we go out on the open market and we acquire agricultural water rights on the Rio Grande. At $25,000 an acre foot, we're putting 5,000 acre foot into the river. That's $125 million of net value, an asset in terms of water management that we have to, account for.
Right.
So there you have it. So we're interested. We're at the table. We feel like, although the NEPA seems fast to some people, it helps get us to the table to make regional decisions on how we manage the resources. And I have nothing to share but positive notes that our governing body wants us to work with the community to come to a reasonable solution. And if that means investing in research, that certainly I think is on the table.
Okay, and I think another question I'd have for you, Bill, again, is if I can get back to, I guess the NEPA is one objective, right? And then where does the mitigation plan fit into that? Is that being considered right now a subset of the NEPA, or is that being considered a subset of water resources and conservation's environmental management system generally, or what's that relationship?
Yeah, I look at it, my perspective is the NEPA informs the more regional planning process with the city, the county, and the community. And so what we learned from the NEPA, including potential for mitigation, in all likelihood, yes. Then what do we do in addition? Certainly we could have the federal mandate to do something to mitigate, as we call it, but maybe we can go above and beyond that. We do have basically wetlands people want protected. We have downstream irrigators with priority water rights. We have to roll that into the equation, but that's not part of NEPA, right?
Correct.
Okay.
Correct, and that's what I was hoping to hear, is that we're not just looking for say robust stakeholder participation in the NEPA, but that we're looking for robust stakeholder participation in the management plan generally. And I think that, yes, in attacking some of these objectives on the different identifiable reaches of the river, I think that's a good step going forward. But I think what the collaborative would like to see is continued involvement in that bigger process. We for sure want to support this NEPA process because it is not just an information gathering, fact-finding opportunity. It's the foundation, right? It's a foundational block upon which I think your bigger environmental management system is built.
Yeah.
I just want to make sure I'm not
that.
misperceiving that, you know?
Yeah, I agree with every word you said. It's the baseline, and then we work from that and build on something bigger and better, you know? So again,
Right.
I advise everyone that'll listen is that if the city and the county maximize its imported San Juan Chama water, it leaves more water for these purposes we're describing here as a collective. I don't know how to put it any other way.
Jamie Park has a question.
Thank you, Carl. Hi, Mr. Schneider. I'm with the New Mexico State Association, and maybe this question's already been answered or brought up by Darren, but I was just curious, in terms of the NEPA process, is the city advocating for just an environmental assessment to be done as opposed to an environmental impact statement?
That is correct.
Okay. And the other comment that I have is just a concern that the NEPA rollbacks implemented by the Trump administration, they're still in effect right now. So I'm just wondering if the city's taking that into consideration and kind of committing to having a meaningful, robust NEPA process, despite some of the negative restrictions of the Trump NEPA rollback.
Yeah, Jamie, so thank you for that comment. And it's my understanding, and so Bureau of Reclamation's advised us actually that those Trump rollbacks have been rescinded under the Biden administration. And
I don't believe that's the case. I mean, there's a number of pending litigation going on right now. But I think the agencies can still commit, and the city as well, to processes to kind of work around that. I don't think you would be necessarily bound to the Trump rollback process per se.
Yeah, agreed. And we will not be following those. I've already been informed of that. Again, I have to clearly state that the Bureau of Reclamation is the lead on the NEPA, not the city of Santa Fe.
Of course, sir. But I do believe you said that it was BLM and Forest Service.
They are co-agencies, but Reclamation is the lead agency.
Okay, and will the Bureau of Indian Affairs be a co-lead agency as well?
So that conversation's happening between the federal government and the sovereign nation of Coche de Pueblo, and that's outside our purview. That's between those two entities. I do not know where Coche de stands.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, any other questions for Stacy? So I think we've got two, Stacy. One is that hydrological connection or lack of a hydrological connection between La Cienega and La Cienega. And the other is just to give us maybe some general information about what a study might entail. Is that too general?
So confirming the hydrologic or connection or disconnection between La Cienega and La Cienega and the different flow paths around there. And then how much water is making its way from the Santa Fe River to the Rio Grande is the other kind of conceptual study.
Right. And this, what a study would entail.
Yeah.
I know that's a big one.
Carl,
Those are all big ones. Yeah. And,
Yeah.
you know, I actually appreciate that we had Alex on to kind of get the conversation going and thinking about some of the things that are already known geochemically and hydrologically in those regions. It might actually be, you know, thinking about Ryan Mann's work and getting students involved, another way to bring in some of the younger generation to get involved, and maybe this is a next big kind of research focus for some young folks with some guidance from expert faculty and researchers at the Bureau of Geology is certainly another way to approach this with a little bit kind of different costs perhaps that goes along with that. So I guess I'm wondering, maybe Carl, you and I can talk offline about this, but in terms of timeline and when are these answers needed? Because if it's next year, that's not really realistic. What's the long-term or shorter-term expectations for some of this? So
That's something we need to discuss for sure.
yeah, and those conversations, I think, Stacy, have been happening with the county too. Is that correct? Because there's been discussions with the city and county of integrating our comprehensive groundwater monitoring program through the Buckman permit as well as the Northwest Well permits with the county out even as far as El Dorado, Arroyo Hondo, and into La Cienega to have a better sort of baseline understanding on the water table.
that's great.
Okay, any other, I think that's the questions for Stacy. And again, Stacy, thank you so much for being part of this. And thank you for being a continuing resource for all of my kind of odd questions. Felicity, you have a question?
Yeah, I was just curious, Bill, that application has been submitted, is that
It's hard to
correct?
hear you.
Oh, it is? Oh, sorry. I don't know why. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, better.
Okay. Bill, has that application been submitted to OSC?
No, like I mentioned, Felicia, we're holding back till we work through how to have the community engagement process and public meetings.
Okay.
But what we plan to do, and tentatively be sometime in July, is file simultaneously the NEPA application or the public scoping announcement with the return flow application with the state engineer. Again, that they both have public engagement components. And so by all means, we're encouraging people to participate. We need the feedback.
Participate in whatever you guys decide, but we'd also like to participate in the design of that. And I'm wondering if there's any room for that. I mean, I know you and Darren were just saying, you know, we want to have a robust process and we want to go above and beyond what NEPA would already establish. And if you're going into that meeting this afternoon, is there a way that you can say this community is highly informed, incredibly engaged, and have a lot to the impacts on this community are huge. So we want to bring them in to discuss this process. Is that possible?
I'm not sure if I understand the question. Is there a direct question? I'm Sorry.
The question is, you said you were going to meet with them this afternoon to see what that stakeholder engagement process is
Yeah.
going to look like.
Yeah,
If-
as I mentioned, you know, we view them in effect as mutually exclusive. So we're looking at establishing what does it mean through the NEPA process if there's no San Juan Chama water in the lower Santa Fe River. Then we learn through what mitigation comes out of that process. And then we continue to work through this larger regional scale process to do this sort of additional exploration on how to sort of meet the needs of everybody. And that's really where the county is a significant contributor to this, and why I feel like that agreement's really important to the community is it now there's skin in the game for everybody to meet those objectives.
That's right. So, and I think maybe where the questions come from, Bill, is we need to start looking at specifically what elements of say, or what clauses of environmental management standards are being met, particularly with respect to your compliance obligations with the Bureau of Reclamation, cooperation, or whatever jurisdiction we have, not just cooperative work to expect from the Forest Service or BLM, and the BIA, wherever that's going to go. But that's what we start, I think, to do now. I think Felicity's saying, correct me if I'm wrong, sister, that you can go into a meeting with Reclamation today and say that this collaborative offers already, you know, a group of interested stakeholders, and the job now might be to separate by degree the potential impacts or the potential influence that the stakeholders can have in your planning process, right? I think it's time to start narrowing those down and start hitting the actual objectives, right?
No, agreed, and certainly that conversation's already taken place, and so Reclamation recognizes that and values the input and the feedback, which is why we're even holding off trying to find the best way to sort of reach out. How do we do this? And if you guys have recommendations, by all means, please contact me, because we're trying to find the best way so that nobody's excluded. I know Zoom, we can look on this call, there's critical people missing because they choose not to be part of Zoom. Where's Alonzo? Like, you know, these are questions, you know, we need to speak with everybody, and we're trying to figure it out, you know, so agreed.
But I want to clarify that our interest isn't in just checking that box in the NEPA application. Our interest is in continuing the participation here to work on this relationship that I've seen just reunite between the city and the county. So I think you're right. The county participation is totally key at this point, and that we have the two entities able to work together to manage the federal intervening agencies that have, you know, skin in the game too. But I think that's it, that we're, again, anyone I hope would speak up if I'm not right in saying we're beyond the point of consensus gathering. We're kind of beyond the point of public outreach. You found us. We're all here. We've all been here for 10 years. And we got to kind of maybe light up the phones or the whatever to get some physical attendance at some sessions. But we should, you know, get out of the plan and do part of this cycle and get into check and act and revise it and give it some life. But
agreed, and I feel like the NEPA process provides that first step. Again, This is a multi-step process. I agree with everything that everyone has stated here. We will lay out the proposal, the project scoping for the community to comment and give us feedback. Where it goes from there, then we'll be systematically addressing, as this group likes to call it, mitigation. I don't know what that looks like. Is it reducing domestic wells? Is it removal of beavers? I don't know. I mean, these are conversations that we have to have. You know.
That's it, because it's not one thing. It's a complex process that does, as you pointed out, that will take into account specific needs of, looks like 4 different reaches of the river. I can see why you would, you know, separate them for the different challenges that exist there. It's not just by jurisdiction either, which was important. But I think what we need is something from the city and the county, more like we would see with a private sector outfit, is a top management commitment. So what I'm looking at this as, the city and the county being top management in this instance, and the other stakeholders and potential beneficiaries or impacted individuals are brought to the table. But I'm seeing a lot of opportunity here, not just risk. So when we look at NEPA and we look at potential impact, we should also be looking at potential opportunities for sustainability, and then get into those other more specific issues of the whys. You know, for my personal interest, it's the cultural and historical impact of a living river. And then there are the economic impacts. And then, this is where we all come together and we're able to make processes that serve all those concerns. I don't want it just to be, we had public meetings, check, and then it moves on, right?
Real quick, Darren, Jamie's got a question, but I wanted to introduce a couple of new members. Paula Garcia, I think we all know, is the executive director of the Acequia Association, and also Steve, he and I are on the county water policy advisory committee, but I don't know enough about you to introduce you. So would you please do that, Steve?
Hopefully I'm the only Steve here on this call. My name is Steve Finch. I'm a hydrogeologist with John Shoemaker and Associates. And I've worked with most everybody on this call on various different projects.
Now, Jamie, you want to ask your question?
Sure. Hi, Mr. Schneider. I just have another process question. I'm curious if the city has given much thought to having the NEPA process be implemented and concluded before submitting its return flow application with the Office of the State Engineer. In my experience, this has been done by a number of state agencies, particularly the Mining and Minerals Division, whereby they prefer to have the NEPA process be completed before they proceed with their environmental impacts analysis, under the New Mexico Mining Act, and proceed to a public hearing. And I think that way of doing things is really beneficial, not just for stakeholders, but for the state agencies themselves. So yeah, I'm just curious if the city's given much thought to that, or alternatively, if the city does proceed with submitting its return flow credit application simultaneously with the kickoff of the NEPA scoping process, if the city is amenable to staying proceedings before the state engineer until the NEPA process concludes. The Water Code does require the city to include in its application mitigation plan. And the city and the county have been referring to this specifically as the Lower Santa Fe River Mitigation Program. And so, yeah, I think this group would ask the city to consider either not submitting its return flow application until after the NEPA process has concluded, or if you do proceed with submitting, stay the proceeding before the Office of the State Engineer until that process concludes.
All right, so that was a very informed question. Thank you for that, Jamie. And maybe I could speak with you a bit offline to get a little bit further clarification on a few things. I guess my first reaction is taken under advisement. I'm not certain why delaying the OSC application provides any benefit to this process. In fact, I guess my position would be that the state engineer has zero jurisdiction over San Juan Chama water. Their only role will be to look at what impacts rediverting it on the Rio Grande after it returns from the pipeline will have on native flows and Rio Grande compact obligations that they have to meet. So with that stated, if there's a valid reason, I will certainly bring this to the attention of our legal team as well as our governing officials, because if there's merit, Jamie, as maybe you're implying that we haven't recognized, we're all ears. We want this to be a fair process. But at the same time, we stand by our conviction that this is federal contract water. I just don't know how else to put it any other way.
Well, thank you for your response and your willingness to perhaps continue that conversation offline.
Yeah, and I don't have your contact information, so if I could get that from Andy or Carl, please, that'd be very helpful.
So, I mean, we basically have moved into the stakeholder process pretty quickly and pretty organically. I do want to mention that in conversations with Jose Varela Lopez, that the Santa Fe Pewaukee Soil and Water Conservation District is very eager to get involved, and they're going to participate more actively in terms of helping us figure out. And I really think it is a mitigation plan, just to deal with the issues that the downstream users have faced. And I don't want to let go of the fact that the problems that wetland below the wastewater treatment plant causes and has caused and continues to cause. It is an absolute mess, and it's something the city has not managed in the 20 years that it's been in existence. And it's something that needs to be dealt with. I mean, all we hear from, number one, we have issues about the management of the wastewater treatment plant. And I think many of us have read in the paper recently about problems, inherent problems there. And so those are things that need to be dealt with. What we've been told repeatedly, no matter how clean you get that water, and again, it doesn't deal with all of the pharmaceuticals and other, the new contaminants. But once you get that water as clean as you can, and it goes through what we call the nutrient sump wetlands, then it's just as dirty as it was when it began. And so that is a mitigation plan. That has to be dealt with. And in terms of what it takes up in terms of water, that doesn't go downstream is another concern. So those are things that have to be part of the conversation without question.
Noted.
I think it's key to understand that maybe what we'll identify through this process is not a series of 2 or 3 magic bullets, right? But that we're committing ourselves to ongoing processes. The management of the lower river watershed did not happen overnight, and it didn't get into its current state overnight. And it's going to require continuous management and continuous stewardship. And that's kind of what we need to build into our plan, is the commitment to do that, and then arrange the resources accordingly so that it's possible.
You make a really important point, Darren, and that's that commitment, because we have to have a commitment that travels through time, that doesn't get changed by another administration, by another change in staff at the city or at the county. And all of a sudden we're going, wait a second, no, you guys, that doesn't apply anymore. It's got to be something that's rock solid, that we can depend on, that we can be assured that this is going to continue through time, that we're not going to get short-circuited down the road.
If I can just amplify on that, Carl, and I think this is maybe to explain to why I keep bringing up an environmental management system or an international standard like 14,001, is because these are accepted and they're quantifiable, and they're beyond the whim and fancy of the latest political fashion, right? So I think that, yes, while it may be in fashion to think the way we're all thinking these days, we should take advantage of it and make something practical and positive out of it before the winds change and we're lost. But if we do have something that's been, as I said, a top management commitment or a leadership commitment from the city and the county, that this is what we're working towards and we'll remain involved with it, then that's as much as we can expect from any participant body.
And I think another thing we need to be aware of are any of the infrastructure plans. Number one, for the plant, because this thing was put in 1962, and it keeps getting patched, and it seems never to be working well. And so I don't know what the city's plans are in terms of infrastructure. We certainly want them to consider what we have done research on, and that's the constructive treatment of wetlands, which we think would be a really wonderful thing to do in terms of actually cleaning the water, but it's a system that needs to be maintained. And I also want to point out, when we repeatedly talked about the wells in La Cienega area, obviously that is a concern. It's been a long-term concern for us in the community. For the last probably 15 years, we've been having that as part of our ICIP request, is to have the county bring in county water. Well, we seem to be closer to doing that at this point. We've been working with the water department in terms, John Dupuy, in terms of creating basically a master plan for the infrastructure. And one of those targets will be the wells in La Cienega. And this is going to be a really big challenge, because the city had, the county has allowed for I call the lot split subdivision. We've added somewhere in the neighborhood of 400 homes over the last 30 years, all of them with wells that were supposed to have meters on them, but they don't have meters on them. And so now we're trying to go back in time and try to fix this. But it's something that is obviously at the county's doorstep, and it's something I think that they need to take care of without question. And so these will be challenges, all part of this big question. I mean, I've talked to some of the older people in the community, and they said at one point that there was as much water in the La Cienega Creek as there was in the Santa Fe River. And that's then another factor is the thing that we've talked about are the wells in the Tesuque Ancha formation that the El Dorado system works. I mean, all of these things have to be part of the puzzle, pieces of the puzzle we put together to make this mitigation plan work for the entire area.
Can I jump in?
Yes,
Here
please.
I think it's important, yes, to view it holistically, and in our work, especially for the Water Policy Advisory Committee, to join them in that bigger picture and have the city as a participant in that. I want to just circle it, bring it back to return flow pipeline, wastewater treatment plant being an integral component in the city's portfolio, be it for return flow water or provision of water to the lower watershed. I'd like to know, Bill, what type of timeframes are we looking at so that we would have a chance to get in with you on ICIP requests, CBDG type requests, infrastructure funding, as we're now watching the 1.3 trillion diminish to 1 trillion. When's it too late before we can't start making broader applications for funding to look for alternatives, infrastructure alternatives, and get that money valve open sooner than later, so that we can see some resources put towards implementation already? I think there's a good opportunity there to make joint applications through the city and the county sooner than later, and kind of do a shotgun attack and see what hits and what we have to work with, but not lose that opportunity to do this cooperatively as soon as possible.
I agree, and we're very interested in that. I feel like this city-county agreement really bridges the gap to get us closer to do that as a collective. So Darren, the city at this point, this is simply a proposal. I know everyone has accused, or at least the opponents to this project have accused us of this as a foregone conclusion. We do not even have an engineering design yet. All right, and so we want to go through the permitting, knowing that this planning process is critical to everybody amongst the Santa Fe River. So to answer your question, minimum 2.5 years, right, before we go through this. And then that depends even if we end up in the courts. And are we going to, through these arguments, are we going to trigger the Anaya adjudication? I mean, there's a lot of questions that I don't know. I don't have a crystal ball on how this will play out. I'm hoping Andy and Carl and this group will see past the litigation and work as a collective, because I feel like we have many common goals. So 2.5 years to answer your question before a decision is even brought forth to the governing body.
Okay, and really more my question was, good. So we have time, but I see it a little differently, that we should probably get together and start examining some of these alternatives and start making some requests for funding. So, but I think that's the work ahead of us, right?
Yeah.
And I think especially too in defining scope for this particular element, this lower watershed mitigation plan of potential consequences from this pipeline, one element of a bigger watershed management plan, which includes maintenance and stewardship.
Yeah, agreed.
And real quickly, I want to recognize Paula Garcia with the Acequia Association. I got to tell you, they have given us a whole lot of support, encouragement. Jamie too, thank you very much in terms of just kind of moving us forward in a really positive way. And I really want to just say thank you very much. And it's something that we deeply appreciate and look forward to continue conversation. But the Acequia Association, as well as the Acequia Commission, have both kind of stepped forward. And again, the Environmental Law Center, they're collaborating with us in providing some guidance. And so I want to thank all of you. And I also want to recognize Christine really very quickly. I've got to talk to you because there's some conservation efforts we need to do in La Cienega, and I look forward to working with you in terms of making some of those things happen, because it's all got to be combined, and there's not a good conservation effort. You know, I was driving through the village yesterday, and I'm looking over at a house that's been probably less than 10 years old with an orchard. And I'm sitting there thinking, well, that's interesting. I wonder how they managed an orchard, you know, with the water, and then the massive places that have landscaping and businesses that are running. And this is where we get to county enforcement. And we're on that track, and we're trying to get their attention to address some of these situations. But the conservation part of that is something that we're missing out in our area. So Christine, I look forward to working with you and trying to figure those things out and helping people understand the need to save water.
Sure, Carl, just let me know when you want to meet.
I appreciate it as always. I think this has been, as always, a very fascinating discussion. And I think this is something that we just need to continue to do. And I'm wondering if we need to do it more than every other month. But we can talk about that. We've got a little bit group of kind of our executive group that gets together. But it's happening pretty quickly. There's a lot to discuss, a lot of things to talk about. And so let's think about what we need to do to move this along. And Steve, I really appreciate your participation. So let's just see what we can do to try and deal with the water issues in our area. I don't think there's anything that's more important on some level, certainly for the rural communities that depend, these rural communities that have depended on the river for hundreds of years. And it's up to us to see what we can do to make sure they're protected. So any other questions, anything people want to bring up or discuss?
Oh, let me throw in one quick thing, following up on something Jamie said earlier. There was an article in the New Mexican today about the status of the Biden administration EPA group, shall we say, working on what the former administration had changed. So that there was a pretty good article in the paper today. I think it was the Associated Press put that together. You might take a look at it. Gives an update of what they're thinking.
Andy, I'm going to call on you to end this meeting by tooting the Water Association's horn and looking at the large scale, comprehensive planning that you're doing for the Santa Fe watershed.
Sure.
So tell us about it.
5 seconds or less. Well, you know, we'd love to partner more with the New Mexico Acequia Association, and we hope to continue to in the future, as well as the city of Santa Fe, as we've been doing. But anyway, the big thing that Carl's referring to is the Water Smart grant that we're currently working on. And of course, it's phase 1 now for a total watershed plan. And the phase 1 is really gathering stakeholder concerns. And I suspect that just about everyone here has been involved in those interviews. They're ongoing now, probably go on for another 2 or 3 months. And then it's called a Q-sort process, trying to make heads or tails, if you want, out of all these different concerns. The other portion of that phase 1 grant that we have is to do the mapping and the library, if you will, resource library. So that's what we're gathering on now.
Explain Utah State's role in it.
Yeah, so we've retained Utah State University, Dr. Courtney Flint, to be conducting this Q-sort process. And I haven't seen it. Of course, it won't until we go to the next step, which is when gathering as many people together as we can in the 3, I'll say, main reaches of the watershed: the lower watershed, the middle watershed, and the upper watershed. And so that is when we'll start seeing the results of her work, and then we can start picking it apart. That's my way of putting it.
That's pretty cool. Okay, folks, anything else today? As I always say, this is my favorite group to meet with. It's always fascinating conversations, and it looks we've got a little bit, to use a nautical term, a little headwind. Now that we have our captain grounded for a while. For those of you that don't know, Darren's been on the seas for how many years probably?
Let's see, we come up with 30 years this morning, huh?
Wow.
So I guess that's 15 years of my life I've spent at sea.
And the captain of a merchant marine freight. Explain what you're captain of.
Yeah, I run unlimited tonnage cargo ships. So I've been transporting commercial and military cargo for everybody from Walmart to Uncle Sam over the course of that career.
All over the world.
Yeah.
Right. Okay, again, thank you all for being here today. Ed, good to see you as always.
Good to see you.
Patricio, nice to see you as well. Look forward to continued conversations and continue working together. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Have a good afternoon.
Bye, everyone.